Voice and Phenomenon by Jacques Derrida, translated from the French by Leonard Lawlor, read by Jacob Flanagan. Chapter 3, Part 1, Meaning as Soliloquy. Let us suppose indication is excluded. What remains is expression. What is expression? It is a sign charged with Bedeutung. Husserl attempts to define it in the fifth section, Ausdrücke als bedeutsame Zeichen. Expressions are signs that mean, voulant dire. A. Doubtlessly Bedeutung comes out upon the sign and transforms it into expression only with speech, with oral discourse. Husserl writes, from indicative signs we distinguish meaningful signs, i.e. expressions. But why expressions and why meaningful signs? Signe voulant dire. We are able to explain this only by tying together a whole sheaf of reasons within the profound unity of one and the same intention. A1. Expression is exteriorization. Expression imprints in a certain outside a sense which is discovered first in a certain inside. Earlier we suggested that this outside and this inside were absolutely original. The outside is neither nature nor the world nor a real exteriority in relation to consciousness. Here is the place to specify this outside. The Bedeuten intends an outside which is that of an ideal object. This outside then is expressed, passes outside of itself into another outside which is still in consciousness. As we are going to see, expressive discourse has no need as such, and in its essence, of being factually uttered in the world. Expression as a meaningful sign, signe voulant dire, is therefore a double existing of sense, sign, outside of itself and in itself, in consciousness, in the with itself, and in the nearby itself that Husserl begins by determining as the solitary life of the soul. Later, after the discovery of the transcendental reduction, he will describe the solitary life of the soul as the noetico-noematic sphere of consciousness. If we refer in anticipation, and for the sake of more clarity, to the corresponding sections of Ideas 1, we see how the unproductive stratum of expression comes to reflect, to mirror, Widerspiegeln, every other intentionality in regard to its form and its content. Relation to objectivity therefore indicates a pre-expressive, or ausdrücklich, intentionality that aims at a sense which will be then transformed into a Bedeutung and an expression. It is not at all obvious that this reflected and repeated exiting towards the noematic sense and then toward expression is an unproductive redoubling, especially if we consider that by unproductivity Husserl intends say, quote, productivity that is exhausted in the expressing and in the form of the conceptual which is introduced with the expression, quote. Therefore we will have to return to this. We only wanted to note here what expression means according to Husserl, the exiting of an act outside of itself, then of a sense which is able to remain in itself only in the voice, in the phenomenological voice. 2. In the logical investigations, the word expression is already imposed for another reason. Expression is an intentional, thoroughly conscious, decided, voluntary exteriorization. There is no expression without the intention of a subject animating the sign, endowing it with Gestiegkeit. In indication, animation has two limits, the body of the sign which is not a breath, and the indicated which is an existence in the world. In expression, the intention is absolutely on purpose because it animates a voice which can remain wholly internal, and because the express is a Bedeutung, that is, an ideality that does not, quote, exist, quote, in the world. A3. Looking at it from another viewpoint will confirm that there can be no expression without a voluntary intention. In fact, expression is always inhabited, animated by a Bedeuten, as a wanting to say, vouloir dire, because for Husserl the Deutung, let us say the interpretation, the understanding, or the cognition of the Bedeutung, can never have taken place outside of oral discourse, Rede, only because a discourse can make itself available to Deutung. The latter is never essentially a reading, but rather a hearing, what wants to say, what the meaning wants to say. The Bedeutung is reserved for the one who speaks, and the one who speaks insofar as he says what he wants to say, on purpose, explicitly, and consciously. Let us verify this. Husserl recognizes that his use of the word expression constrains the language a little, but the constraint which is thus practiced purifies his intention and at once reveals a common stock of metaphysical implications. Husserl writes, quote, to lay down for provisional intelligibility that each discourse rita or part of discourse ridatai, as also each sign that is essentially of the same sort shall count as an expression whether or not such discourse is actually uttered, wirklich geredet, or addressed with a communicative intent to any persons or not, unquote. Thus all of what constitutes the actuality of what is uttered, the physical incarnation of the Bedeutung, the body of speech, which is in its ideality belongs to an empirically determinate language, is, if not outside of discourse, at least foreign to expressivity as such, to this pure intention, without which no discourse would be possible. The entire stratum of empirical actuality, that is, the factual totality of discourse, belongs to this indication, the extent of which we have not finished recognizing. The actuality, the totality of these events of discourse, is not only indicative because it is in the world, abandoned to the world, but also correlatively because, as such, the actuality of discourse keeps in itself something of involuntary association. For if intentionality has never simply meant will, volonté, it indeed seems that in the order of the lived experiences of expression, supposing that it has limits, intentional consciousness and voluntary consciousness are, in Husserl's eyes, synonyms. And if we were just thinking as Husserl will authorize in Ideas 1, that every intention no lived experience can in principle be taken up into a lived experience of expression, we should perhaps conclude that despite all the themes of receptive or intuitive intentionality and of passive genesis, the concept of intentionality is still taken in the tradition of a voluntaristic metaphysics, that is, perhaps taken simply in the metaphysics. The explicit teleology that orders all of transcendental phenomenology would basically be only a transcendental voluntarism. Sense wants to signify itself. It expresses itself only in a wanting to say, which is only a wanting to say itself of the presence of sense. This explains that all of what escapes from pure spiritual intention, from pure animation by the Geist, which is the will, all of that is excluded from Bedeuten, and therefore from expression. For example, facial expressions, the various gestures, the totality of the body, and of mundane registration in a world, the totality of the visible as such and of the spatial as such, that is, insofar as they are not worked over by Geist, by the will, by the Gestigkeit, which, in the word as well as in the human body, transforms the Körper into flesh, life. The opposition of the soul and the body is not only at the center of this doctrine of signification. It is confined by the doctrine, and it has always basically been done in philosophy. The opposition depends on an interpretation of language. Visibility as such and spatiality as such could only lose the self-presence of the will and of the spiritual animation which opens up discourse. They are literally the death of that self-presence. As Husserl writes, such a definition excludes from expression facial expressions and the various gestures involuntarily, willkürlich, accompany speech without communicative intent, or those in which a person's psychic states achieve understandable expression for his environment, without the added help of discourse. Such externalizations, Ausdrücken, are not expressions in the sense of discourse, Rede. They have no phenomenal unity in the consciousness of the one who externalizes self with the externalized lived experiences. By means of them, an individual communicates nothing to another. In the externalization of these lived experiences, by means of them, the intention to expose some thought in an express way, Ausdruckliche Weise, is missing, whether for the individual himself in his solitary state or for others, such as expressions. In short, properly speaking, no Bedeutung. Derrida again. They do not want to say anything because they do not want to say anything. In the order of signification, the express intention is an intention to express. The implicit does not belong to the essence of discourse. What Husserl asserts here concerning gestures and facial expressions would of course have to hold a fortiori for preconscious and unconscious language, that we may eventually interpret the gesture, the facial expression, the non-conscious, the involuntary indication in general, that we may at times take them up and make them explicit in a discursive and express commentary that only confirms, in Husserl's eyes, the preceding distinctions. This interpretation, Deutung, makes a latent expression be heard, wanting to say, bedeuten, vouloir dire, which was still holding itself in reserve. Non-expressive signs want to say bedeuten only insofar as one can make them say what was murmuring in them, what was wanting to be said in a sort of rumbling. Gestures want to say only insofar as we can listen to them, interpret them, deuten. As long as we identify sign and bedeutung, all of what resists the Deutung has no sense and is not language in the strict sense. The essence of language is its telos, and its telos is voluntary consciousness as wanting to say. The indicative sphere represents all of what, while interweaving itself with expression, cannot be taken up into a deliberate discourse that is permeated by wanting to say. For all of these reasons, we do not have the right to distinguish between indication and expression as between a non-linguistic sign and a linguistic sign. Husserl traces out a border which does not pass between language and non-language, but within language in general, between the express and the non-express, with all of their connotations, for it would be difficult and in fact impossible to exclude from language all the indicative forms. At most we can therefore distinguish with Husserl between linguistic signs in the strict sense and the linguistic signs in the broad sense. Justifying his exclusion of gestures and facial expression, Husserl in effect concludes, quote, "It is not to the point that another person may interpret deuten our involuntary externalizations in willkürlichen Ausdrücken, exempli gratia expressive moments, and that he may therefore become deeply acquainted with our inner thoughts and emotions. These externalizations, want to say, bedeuten, something to him insofar as he interprets deutet them, but even for him they have no bedeutungen in the strict sense of linguistic signs. Impragnanten sinnesprachliche Zeichen, but only in the sense of indicating," unquote. This leads us to look for the limit of the indicative field still further. In fact, even for the one who restores the discursivity in the gestures of others, the indicative manifestations of others are not transformed into expressions. It is the interpreter who expresses himself in regard to them. Perhaps there is something in the relation to others that makes indication irreducible. B. In fact, it is not enough to recognize oral discourse as the milieu of expressivity. Once we have excluded all the non-discursive signs which are given immediately as exterior to speech, gestures, facial expressions, still we find, this time within speech, a non-expressivity whose scope is considerable. This non-expressivity is not only based on the physical side of expression, the sensible sign, the articulate phonic complex, the sign written on paper. Husserl writes, quote, "The simple distinction between physical signs and sense-giving lived experiences in general is by no means enough, and not at all enough for logical purposes," unquote. Considering now the non-physical side of discourse, Husserl therefore excludes from it, always under the heading of indication, all that arises from the communication or from the manifestations of psychical lived experience. The movement that justifies this exclusion should teach us a lot about the metaphysical tenor of phenomenology. The themes which are presented here will never be put back into question by Husserl. On the contrary, they will constantly get confirmed. They are going to make us think that what, in the final analysis, separates expression from indication is what we could call the immediate non-self presence of the living present. The values of mundane existence, naturality, sensibility, empiricity, association, etc., which determine the concept of indication, are perhaps, across of course many mediations that we are anticipating, going to find their final unity in this non-presence, and this non-presence of the living present will qualify simultaneously the relation to others in general and the self-relation of temporalization. This is sketched out slowly, discreetly, but rigorously in the logical investigations. We have seen the difference between indication and expression was functional or intentional, but not substantial. Husserl can therefore consider that the elements of the order